Your daughter's noise is ruining the vibe, Adrienne. It's just a piece of wood. Get over it. That's what my brother said to me at his own engagement party, 3 drinks deep, grinning like he just told the funniest joke in the room. He said it loud enough for every single person on that patio to hear. And then he picked up my 10-year-old daughter's violin, the one I'd spent $12,400 on, the one she'd been playing since she was 6, and he threw it into the deep end of the saltwater pool. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood there, watching the case sink, watching the bubbles rise to the surface, and I felt something inside me go very, very quiet. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't really about a violin. It's about 8 years of silence, $214,500 in invisible support, and the one calm phone call that brought it all crashing down. If you've ever had a family member treat you like you didn't matter, hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Adrienne Kessler. I'm 35 years old. I'm a single mother to Nora, who just turned 10, and I own a boutique HR consulting firm in Nashville, Tennessee. I built it from nothing. No inheritance, no partner, no safety net. Just long hours, smart decisions, and a stubbornness that my mother always called difficult and my clients call thorough. Last year, my firm cleared $185,000 in personal income. My net worth, between the business equity and my diversified savings, sits at roughly $1.2 million. Nora doesn't know that number. She doesn't need to. What she knows is that we have a good life, a safe home, and that her music matters to me more than almost anything. But my family? My family has never once acknowledged any of it. Not the business, not the savings, not the years I spent working weekends to make sure Nora had everything she needed. To them, I was never Adrienne the business owner. I was never Adrienne the provider. I was just Adrienne, the older sister who could always be counted on to write a check. My brother Grant is 4 years younger than me. He's 31. And for as long as I can remember, Grant has been the son that the entire Kessler family orbits around. He was the baby, the charmer, the one with the big smile and the bigger plans that never quite materialized. Grant graduated from college 8 years ago with a balance of $42,000 in tuition debt. He didn't ask me for help. He didn't have to. My mother, Barbara, called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice light and casual, like she was asking me to pick up milk on my way home. She said Grant was under so much pressure that he was such a talented young man, and wouldn't it be wonderful if his big sister could help him get a fresh start? I wrote the check for $42,000. I told myself it was an investment in my brother's future. 6 months later, Grant needed an apartment in a nicer part of town because he'd landed a marketing job and needed to look the part. The deposit and first 6 months of rent came to $18,600. My mother called again. Same light voice, same casual tone. I paid it. Then there was the time Barbara called me in a panic saying she needed $15,000 for a medical emergency. I transferred the money within the hour. I didn't ask questions. I didn't hesitate. She was my mother, and she said she needed help. I found out 3 months later that there was no medical emergency. The $15,000 went to pay off Grant's credit card debt. When I brought it up at Sunday dinner, my mother laughed. Actually laughed. She waved her hand and said, "Oh, Adrienne, don't make it into a federal case. Your brother needed a little help. That's what family does." My father, George, sat at the head of the table and said nothing. He cut his roast beef into small, precise squares and didn't look up. That was his signature move. 35 years of watching his wife dismiss me, and the most George Kessler ever contributed was the sound of his fork against the plate. Over 8 years, I calculated it once. I sat at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet and went through every wire transfer, every check, every Venmo payment. The total came to $214,500. That's what I had given the Kessler family in loans that were never repaid, emergencies that were never real, and investments that produced nothing but Grant's next request. And not once, not a single time, did anyone say thank you. I told myself it was just what family did. I pushed the resentment down. I focused on Nora, on the firm, on building something solid and real, and for a while, that was enough. Then, 18 months ago, Grant met Whitney Miller. Whitney was 29, blonde, and came from a family in Brentwood that valued the appearance of wealth the way most people value oxygen. Everything about Whitney was curated. Her clothes, her social media, her opinions, and her opinion of me was established within the first 5 minutes of our introduction at a restaurant Grant couldn't afford. She looked at my shoes, then at my purse, then back at Grant with a small, tight smile that said everything without a single word. From the moment Whitney entered the picture, Grant's demands escalated. It wasn't just money anymore. It was image. He needed Adrienne to subsidize the Kessler image, as he actually phrased it once, without a trace of irony. He needed me to help fund dinners at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than my grocery bill. He needed me to keep quiet about the fact that his marketing manager salary was mid-level at best, and that he was frequently between projects, which was the Kessler family's polite way of saying unemployed. I started saying no, quietly, without elaboration, just no, and that's when the temperature changed. And Barbara began calling more often, her voice less casual and more pointed. Your brother is building a life, Adrienne. Don't be selfish. George continued his lifelong practice of saying nothing at all, though I noticed he'd stopped making eye contact with me entirely. Grant stopped calling me himself. He had Whitney do it. And Whitney had a particular talent for making a request sound like a threat. It would mean so much to Grant if you could help with the venue deposit. Family shows up for family, right, Adrienne? I showed up. I always showed up. But I had stopped writing checks, and that apparently was unforgivable. Then came the engagement party. It was a Saturday evening in June, held at my parents' house. Barbara had spent weeks planning it. Fairy lights strung across the back patio, white tablecloths, champagne flutes catching the last of the sunset, a catered spread with shrimp cocktail, bruschetta, and a 3-tier cake that I later learned had been charged to a credit card that was already $9,000 over its limit. 40 people, neighbors, friends, Whitney's parents from Brentwood, a few of Grant's colleagues. Everyone dressed sharp, everyone smiling. The whole evening was designed to look like something out of a magazine, which was exactly what Whitney wanted. Nora and I arrived at 6:45 p.m. Nora wore a blue dress she'd picked out herself and had her violin case in her hand. She'd been practicing a piece for 3 weeks. Mendelssohn. She was nervous but excited because Barbara had specifically asked her to play something special for the happy couple. I should have known better. I should have seen it coming. But Nora had been so proud, practicing every evening after homework, and I couldn't bring myself to take that away from her. We found seats near the edge of the patio. Grant came over briefly, clapped me on the shoulder like I was a business associate he barely remembered, and said, "Glad you made it. Try the shrimp." He didn't say a word to Nora, didn't even look at her. Whitney floated past in an emerald silk dress, trailing perfume and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She glanced at the violin case. "Oh," she said. "She brought that." Then she walked away. The evening moved forward. Toasts were made. Grant gave a speech about how Whitney had elevated him. Barbara dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin and squeezed Grant's arm like he'd just been awarded the Nobel Prize. George stood in the corner near the grill, holding a beer he never drank, staring at the fence. At 7:14 p.m., Barbara waved Nora up to the front of the patio. "Come on, sweetheart," she said, her voice syrupy and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Play something pretty for your uncle and his beautiful bride." Nora looked at me. I nodded. She stood up, opened the case, lifted the violin, and began to play. The Mendelssohn filled the patio. It wasn't perfect. She was 10. But it was earnest, and it was beautiful in the way that only a child playing with her whole heart can be. A few of the guests near the front smiled. One woman put her hand over her chest. Whitney leaned into Grant's ear. I watched her lips move. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her nose wrinkle, saw the small shake of her head. Grant smirked. Then he laughed. Nora kept playing. She hadn't noticed yet. Whitney turned to the woman beside her and said, loud enough to carry, "Is it almost over? This is a little screechy for a party. Low-class noise, don't you think?" A few people shifted uncomfortably. Barbara let out a short, high laugh and covered her mouth with her hand, the way she always did when she wanted to seem like she wasn't encouraging something she was absolutely encouraging. And then Grant stood up. He walked toward Nora with that same loose grin he always wore when he'd had 3 drinks and felt invincible. Nora saw him coming and stopped playing, mid-phrase, the bow hovering above the strings. Her eyes went wide. "That's enough, kiddo," Grant said. He reached out and took the violin from her hands. Nora's fingers tightened, then released. She didn't fight him. She'd been taught not to make scenes. Grant held the violin up by the neck, turning it toward the crowd like he was presenting evidence. "This thing," he said, and his voice carried across the entire patio, "sounds like a cat being stepped on." Whitney laughed. Barbara pressed her lips together and shook her head, smiling. George looked at his shoes. "Your daughter's noise is ruining the vibe, Adrienne. It's just a piece of wood. Get over it." He said it directly to me, eyes locked on mine. Then he turned, walked 3 steps to the edge of the pool, and threw the violin into the deep end. The splash was louder than it should have been. The case was still open on the chair where Nora had been sitting. The bow was still in her hand. For a moment, nobody moved. The fairy light swayed in the breeze. The champagne sat untouched on the table nearest me. I could hear the pool filter humming. Then Whitney started clapping. Slow, sarcastic, like she was applauding the end of an inconvenience. Barbara let out another one of those laughs, shorter this time, almost reflexive. A few of Grant's friends chuckled uncomfortably. I looked at Nora. Her face was completely blank, not crying, not angry. Blank. The way a child's face goes when something breaks so deeply inside them that the emotion hasn't found a way out yet. She was still holding the bow. Her knuckles were white. I felt nothing. Not anger. Not pity. Nothing. And that was the moment something inside me snapped. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a clean, quiet break. Like a string pulled past its limit and finally letting go. I stood up slowly. I walked past Grant, who was already turning back to his guests, with his hands raised like he'd just won something. I walked past Whitney, who watched me with that small, satisfied smile. I walked past my mother, who started to say something and then stopped when she saw my face. I walked to the edge of the pool, crouched down, and reached into the water. The violin had settled on the bottom, about 4 feet down. I pulled it out carefully, both hands steady, water streaming off the body and pooling on the concrete around my feet. The strings were slack. The bridge had shifted. The wood was already beginning to absorb the chlorine and salt. A $12,400 instrument. Custom crafted, professional grade. The only thing Nora truly cherished. I held it for a moment, letting the water drain. Then I placed it gently back into its case, closed the latches, and picked it up. I walked back to Nora. I took the bow from her hand, slid it into the case's holder, and snapped the lid shut. Nora looked up at me with those wide, searching eyes, and I put my hand on her shoulder. "Let's go," I said quietly. Grant called after me. "Oh, come on, Adrienne. It's just a piece of wood. Stop being so dramatic. This is my night, not hers." I didn't turn around. I kept my hand on Nora's shoulder. I walked through the patio, past the fairy lights and the 3-tier cake and the 40 guests who said nothing, and I opened the back gate. The last thing I heard before the gate clicked shut behind us was my mother's voice, light and exasperated, carrying across the yard like it always did. "She'll get over it. You know how your sister gets?" I buckled Nora into the back seat. She hadn't said a word since Grant took the violin from her hands. I placed the case in the trunk, closed it softly, and got behind the wheel. The engine started with a low, steady hum. I pulled out of the driveway without looking back. We were 3 blocks away when Nora finally spoke. Her voice was small, cracked right down the middle. "What did I do wrong, Mom?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her blue dress was still perfectly neat. She looked like a child trying very hard to understand something that should never have been asked of her. I kept my voice steady. "Nothing, baby. You didn't do a single thing wrong." She nodded. Then she turned her face toward the window, and I watched a single tear slide down her cheek and disappear into the collar of her dress. I drove the rest of the way home in silence. The streetlights cut through the windshield in steady intervals. My phone buzzed twice in my purse. I didn't reach for it. I was done pretending this was okay. The house was dark when we got home. I carried Nora inside, helped her change out of the blue dress, and tucked her into bed. She didn't ask about the violin. She didn't ask about Grant or Whitney or why Grandma had laughed. She just pulled the blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, and I sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed and I was sure she was asleep. Then I went to the kitchen. I set the violin case on the counter and opened it. The smell hit me first. Salt and chlorine, sharp and chemical, already seeping into the spruce. I ran my fingers along the body. The varnish was clouding. The seams along the lower bout were beginning to separate where the water had gotten in. The tailpiece was loose. One of the fine tuners had snapped clean off. I took photos, 12 of them, every angle, close-ups of the seam separation, the warped fingerboard, the clouded varnish, the missing tuner. I used the overhead kitchen light and laid a white dish towel underneath for contrast, the way I'd seen appraisers do it. Each photo was time-stamped. Each one was saved to a folder I created on my phone called June 14th, Engagement Party. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The Nest camera on my parents' pool had been installed 2 years ago, after a neighbor's kid nearly drowned at a barbecue. I'd been the one who suggested it. I'd been the one who set it up. And because I'd been the one who created the account, I still had the login credentials. I pulled up the footage from that evening. The camera had a clear, wide-angle view of the entire pool deck. I scrubbed forward to 7:14 p.m. and watched it happen again in high definition. Nora playing, Whitney leaning in, Grant standing up, Grant taking the violin, Grant walking to the pool, Grant throwing it. The splash looked smaller on screen than it had felt in person. I saved the clip. I downloaded it twice, once to my laptop and once to an external drive I kept in my home office for client files. Then I opened a blank document and began typing. I listed the violin's serial number, which I'd memorized the day I purchased it. I listed the date of purchase, the name of the luthier, the original invoice amount of $12,400, and the trust under which it was held. I listed the insurance policy number, the annual premium of $1,400 that I paid from my firm's account, and the named parties on the policy. Grant Kessler was listed as a named insured. I had added him 3 years ago to consolidate the family's coverage and reduce the premium. He had never paid a cent toward it. He probably didn't even remember being on it. I typed for 45 minutes. When I was finished, I had a 5-page document with every relevant fact, every dollar amount, every date, and every piece of evidence cataloged and cross-referenced. I saved it to the same folder. Then I closed the laptop. The kitchen was quiet. The only light was the glow from the microwave clock reading 3:17 a.m. I sat there for a long time, looking at the violin case on the counter, the water still pooled beneath it on the granite. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I expected anger. I expected the hot, chest-tightening fury that usually came after one of Grant's performances. But there was nothing like that. What I felt was closer to clarity, like someone had cleaned a window I'd been looking through for 8 years, and now I could see the yard for what it actually was. Not neglected, not overgrown, just empty. There was nothing there. There never had been. I didn't make a decision in that moment. That's not quite right. The decision had already been made. It was made the second I saw Nora's face go blank on that patio. What I did at 3:17 a.m. was simply organize the paperwork. I went to bed. I slept 5 hours. I woke up at 8:30 on Sunday morning, made Nora pancakes, and didn't mention the party. She didn't bring it up either. We spent the day at the park. She fed ducks. She held my hand on the walk home. She didn't ask about the violin once, which told me more about the depth of the wound than any tears could have. My phone buzzed 14 times that day. Grant, Barbara, Grant again. Whitney once, at 4:12 p.m. I didn't open any of them. I turned off the ringer and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. Monday morning arrived like any other. I got Nora on the school bus at 7:45. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the 5-page document on screen. At exactly 9 a.m., I picked up the phone and called the insurance company's claims department. The automated system routed me through 3 menus before a human voice answered. Claims processing, this is Arthur Wright speaking. Arthur Wright was a senior claims adjuster. I looked him up on the company's website the night before. He'd spent 14 years in fraud investigation before moving to claims. His LinkedIn described him as methodical and detail-oriented. That was what I needed. Mr. Wright, I said, my name is Adrienne Kessler. I need to file a claim for the intentional destruction of an insured instrument. There was a pause. A short one, but I heard it. Intentional destruction, he repeated. Can you clarify that for me? A named insured on the policy deliberately took a $12,400 violin and threw it into a saltwater pool. I have time-stamped photographs of the damage, the original purchase invoice, and high-definition security footage of the act itself. Another pause. Longer this time. Ma'am, I want to make sure I understand. You're filing a claim not for accidental damage, but for deliberate destruction by a party named on the policy? That's correct. You understand that this designation triggers a mandatory investigation? This isn't a standard property claim. If the destruction was intentional and committed by a named insured, the company is required to refer it for potential fraud review. I understand completely, I said. That's why I'm calling. I heard the faint click of a keyboard on his end. Arthur Wright didn't ask me to reconsider. He didn't suggest I file it as an accident to simplify things. He simply said, I'll need the policy number, the serial number of the instrument, and any supporting documentation you can provide. I gave him everything. The policy number, the serial number, the trust documentation, the luthier's invoice for $12,400, the 12 time-stamped photographs, and the security footage, which I sent via the company's secure upload portal while he waited on the line. The upload took 4 minutes. Neither of us spoke during it. Ms. Kessler, Arthur said when it was done, I've reviewed the initial footage. The act appears unambiguous. I'm flagging this for our Special Investigations Unit. The named insured, Grant Kessler, will receive formal notification within 72 hours. He'll be required to provide a recorded statement. I understand. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the file? I thought about it. About the $42,000 in tuition, the $18,600 apartment, the $15,000 fake medical emergency, the $214,500 total. I thought about Nora's blank face and the sound the violin made when it hit the water. No, I said. The documentation speaks for itself. I hung up. The call had lasted 11 minutes. I set the phone down on the table and took a sip of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I sat there for a moment, both hands around the mug, and I waited for the guilt to arrive. It didn't come. 3 days later, Grant called me. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I answered because I knew what was coming and I wanted to hear it. Adrian. His voice was loose, almost amused. I just got some kind of letter from your insurance company? Something about an investigation? Is this a joke? I stayed quiet, letting him continue. Seriously, is this one of your little passive-aggressive moves? Because if you're trying to get back at me for the party, this is pathetic. It was a violin. It's not like I burned down your house. It's not a joke, Grant. Then what is it? Some kind of claim? For what? 12 grand? Adrian, come on. Mom said you were upset, but this is insane. The claim is for $12,400, I said, keeping my voice steady. For the intentional destruction of an insured instrument, you're listed as a named insured on the policy, which means the investigation is directed at you specifically. They'll be asking you for a recorded statement. For the first time in the conversation, the amusement left his voice. A recorded statement? What am I supposed to say? That's between you and the adjuster. Adrian, I'll just tell them it was an accident. I was holding it and it slipped. It's not that complicated. Grant, I paused. There's security footage from the Nest camera on the pool deck. High definition. Time-stamped at 7:14 p.m. It shows you taking the violin from Nora's hands, walking to the edge of the pool, and throwing it in. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it. You're going to want to be careful about what you say in that recorded statement, I said. If the footage contradicts your account, the company is required to refer the discrepancy to the district attorney's office. The district attorney? His voice cracked on the second word. Adrian, this is insane. Over a violin? You're going to get me in legal trouble over a piece of wood? The insurance company isn't asking me for the money, Grant. They're asking the district attorney why you signed a statement saying the violin fell when there's high-definition video of you throwing it. I could hear his breathing change. The swagger was gone. The charm was gone. What was left was the sound of a 31-year-old man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that his sister wasn't going to fix this one. "Call them back," he said. "Call them back right now and tell them it was an accident. Tell them you made a mistake." "No." "Adrian, I'm serious. This could mess up everything. Whitney's parents are already asking questions. If this gets out, that's not my concern. You're holding me hostage over $12,000? I'm filing an accurate claim for the destruction of my daughter's property. Everything in that file is documented, time-stamped, and verified. There's nothing to call back. You can't be serious." His voice was rising now, the way it always did when things didn't bend to him fast enough. "This is financial murder. You're going to ruin my life over your kid's hobby?" I said nothing. There was nothing to add. "Fine," he spat. "Fine. I'll pay for the stupid violin. I'll write you a check tonight. Just call them off." The investigation isn't something I can withdraw, Grant. Once a claim is filed for intentional destruction with supporting video evidence, the process is automatic. The adjuster told me that on the call. The line went dead. He hung up without another word. My phone began lighting up within the hour. Barbara first, at 7:22 p.m. Then George's number, which meant Barbara was standing over his shoulder making him call. Then Whitney, at 7:41. Then Barbara again. Then Grant from a different number. I let every call go to voicemail. I deleted each one without listening. The next morning, at 8:03 a.m., the doorbell rang. I was pouring Nora's cereal. I told her to stay at the table and walk to the front door. Grant was standing on the porch. His shirt was untucked. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he hadn't shaved. Barbara was behind him, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. George was standing on the walkway near the car, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. Grant started talking before I fully opened the door. "You need to stop this, Adrian. Right now. This has gone way too far. We're family. You don't do this to family." I kept my hand on the door frame. I didn't step aside. "I didn't do anything to you, Grant. You threw a $12,400 instrument into a pool in front of 40 people. I filed an accurate insurance claim. Everything else is the process." Barbara stepped forward. "Adrian, for God's sake, let it go. For family. He's your brother. He made a mistake. You're going to drag him through a legal investigation over a child's toy? It wasn't a toy, Mom. It was a custom-crafted professional-grade violin, and it was Nora's." "Nora will get over it," Barbara said. "Kids bounce back. You're making everyone uncomfortable." I looked at my mother. I looked at her carefully, the way you look at something you've been staring at for 35 years and are finally seeing clearly. "Where's your apology to Nora?" I asked. Barbara blinked. "What?" "You asked my daughter to play in front of 40 people. You watched your son take the instrument out of her hands. You watched him throw it into the pool. And you laughed. So I'm asking you, where is your apology to my 10-year-old daughter?" Barbara's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Grant. Grant looked at the ground. George stood at the end of the walkway and said nothing at all. "That's what I thought," I said. Grant lunged forward, not physically, but verbally, his voice cracking high and desperate. "Adrian, please. The adjuster called yesterday. He's asking about a recorded statement. Whitney's parents found out. If I get charged with something, I'll lose my job. There's a moral turpitude clause in my contract. Please. I'm asking you. Please call it off." I looked at my brother. His eyes were wet. His hands were shaking. He looked like a man standing on the edge of something he'd never imagined, and I realized with a kind of terrible calm that this was the first real consequence Grant Kessler had ever faced in his life. "I'm not calling anyone," I said. "I'm not withdrawing anything, and I'm not writing any more checks. Adrian, we're done, Grant." I stepped back. The door closed softly. No slam. Just the quiet click of the lock sliding into place. I stood in the hallway and listened to the sounds on the other side. Barbara's voice, sharp and muffled. Grant's, higher, cracking. The shuffle of shoes on the porch. Then the car doors. Then the engine. Then nothing. The house fell into total silence. I walked back to the kitchen. Nora was sitting at the table, her cereal untouched, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up at me with those wide, searching eyes. "Will we see Grandma and Grandpa again?" she asked. I sat down across from her. I reached over and put my hand on top of hers. I don't know, baby, I said. But I know this. Nobody's going to make you feel like that again. Not while I'm here. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her spoon and started eating. I sat with her in the quiet kitchen, the morning light coming through the window, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not anger, not sadness, not triumph. Just peace. Clean and sharp and unmistakable, like a string finally tuned to exactly the right pitch. I picked up my phone. I went through my contacts methodically. I blocked Grant's number. I blocked Barbara's. I blocked Whitney's. I removed myself from the family group chat. I deleted 3 saved voicemails without listening to them. I changed the gate code on the front entrance from the security app. I didn't do it in anger. I did it in clarity. When I was finished, I set the phone face down on the counter and took a sip of my coffee. It was still warm. Nora looked up from her cereal. Mom, are you okay? I looked at my daughter, 10 years old, still wearing her pajamas, still trusting me to make the world make sense. Yeah, baby, yes, I said. I'm okay. The house was quiet. The morning light was steady, and for the first time in 8 years, I didn't owe anyone a single thing. The weeks following the door closing moved like water finding its level, slow at first, then settling into something even and still. I didn't seek updates. I didn't call mutual friends. I didn't check social media. I had blocked every number, removed myself from every shared space, and turned off every notification that connected me to the Kessler family. The silence wasn't heavy. It was clean. It was the first real quiet I'd had in 8 years, and I let it fill the house the way sunlight fills a room when you finally open the blinds. Nora went back to school that Monday. She didn't mention the violin. She didn't mention Grant or Whitney or the party. She came home, did her homework, and asked if we could watch a movie after dinner. We watched something animated with talking animals. She laughed 3 times. I counted. The investigation moved forward without me. Arthur Wright called once, 2 weeks after the filing, to confirm that Grant had provided his recorded statement. He didn't share the contents. He didn't need to. All he said was, Ms. Kessler, the footage and the statement have been reviewed. There are material discrepancies. The file has been referred to the Davidson County District Attorney's Office. I thanked him. He said, You don't need to thank me. The documentation did the work. I hung up and went back to making dinner. The information came in pieces after that, the way it does when you're no longer inside the circle, but the circle keeps collapsing loud enough for the neighbors to hear. A colleague of mine whose firm shared office space with Grant's marketing agency mentioned it first, casually, over coffee. Then a client whose brother worked in commercial insurance asked if I was the Kessler from the fraud referral. I didn't confirm or deny. I just listened. Grant lied on his recorded statement. He told the adjuster the violin had slipped from his hands while he was moving it out of the way. He said it fell. He said the pool was behind him and he didn't realize how close he was to the edge. He said it was an accident. The high-definition Nest footage showed him walking 11 deliberate steps from where Nora was standing to the deep end. It showed him holding the violin by the neck, arm extended. It showed the arc of the throw. It showed the splash. It showed him turning back to the crowd with his hands raised, grinning. The discrepancy between his statement and the video wasn't a gray area. It was a clean, documented lie to an insurance investigator on a recorded line. The district attorney's office filed charges for insurance fraud within 6 weeks of the referral. Grant was arrested on a Tuesday morning at 7:40 a.m. He was at his apartment. Whitney answered the door. 2 things happened very quickly after that. The first was Grant's employer. The marketing firm where he'd held his mid-level position had a moral turpitude clause in every employee contract. An arrest for insurance fraud triggered an automatic review. The review took 8 days. On the 9th day, Grant was terminated for cause. His annual salary of $45,000 stopped that afternoon. The second was Whitney. Whitney Miller, who had clapped when the violin hit the water, who had called Nora's playing screechy and low-class noise, who had spent 18 months encouraging Grant to demand money from me to maintain an image neither of them had earned, quietly returned her engagement ring 2 weeks after the arrest. The ring was worth $30,000. I later learned Grant had financed it at 22% interest. Whitney moved back to her parents' house in Brentwood. She changed her phone number. She scrubbed every photo of Grant from her social media within 48 hours, as methodically as I had scrubbed every Kessler from my contacts. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt nothing about Whitney at all. She had simply done what Whitney always did. She curated. The months that followed were clinical in their destruction. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just the slow, steady erosion of a life that had been built on someone else's money and held together by someone else's silence. Grant pleaded no contest to the insurance fraud charge. His attorney negotiated it down from a felony to a misdemeanor, but the plea came with $12,400 in restitution for the violin and $8,500 in legal fees. He didn't have the money. He'd never had the money. The $20,900 total sat on his record like a weight he couldn't shift. Without his salary, Grant couldn't make rent. He moved out of the apartment I'd originally put the deposit on 8 years earlier and into a studio across town, the kind with thin walls and a shared laundry in the basement. His car, a leased BMW that had been part of the Kessler image, went back to the dealership. He started driving a 10-year-old Civic that a former colleague sold him for $3,200. Job applications went nowhere. Background checks pulled up the fraud charge. Marketing firms, even small ones, didn't want the liability. 3 months after the termination, Grant took a night shift at a warehouse distribution center off Murfreesboro Road. The pay was $16.50 an hour. Barbara called me once during this period. Not from her phone, which was blocked, but from a number I didn't recognize. I answered before I realized who it was. "Adrian," she said. Her voice was different. Not light, not casual, thin. "Your brother is working nights in a warehouse. He's lost everything. Whitney left. He can barely afford groceries. Are you satisfied?" I stayed quiet for a moment. "Are you calling to apologize to Nora?" I asked. Silence. "Then we have nothing to discuss." I hung up and blocked the new number. George never called. I didn't expect him to. His silence had been lifelong, and it would remain so. I imagined him at the kitchen table in that house, cutting his food into small, precise squares, staring at his plate while the world he'd permitted through inaction slowly disassembled itself around him. I felt nothing about that either. Through the same industry channels, I learned that Barbara and George's finances had shifted in ways they hadn't anticipated. 8 years of relying on my invisible $214,500 in support had masked the fact that their own savings were thinner than they'd admitted. Without my quiet deposits covering Grant's shortfalls, without my checks absorbing his emergencies, the gaps became visible. They refinanced the house. They canceled the cable. Barbara started driving for a rideshare service 3 afternoons a week. She was 60 years old. I didn't track these details deliberately. They simply arrived, the way weather reports arrive. I noted them. I didn't dwell. The months passed. Summer turned to fall. Fall turned to winter. I found a new violin for Nora. It took 3 months of research, 2 trips to a luthier in Knoxville, and a final visit to a workshop outside of Asheville, where a craftsman named Thomas Harris built instruments by hand. The new violin cost $15,000. It was maple and spruce, hand-varnished, with a tone that the luthier described as warm but precise. I didn't tell Nora the price. I told her it was made just for her. She held it for a full minute before she played a single note. Just held it against her shoulder, eyes closed, fingers resting on the strings. When she finally drew the bow across the A string, the sound that came out filled the room like something that had been waiting patiently to be heard. We moved that December, not far. A neighborhood 12 minutes from her school, with a fenced yard and a maple tree that dropped red leaves across the lawn every October. The house had 3 bedrooms. I converted the smallest one into a music studio. I had it soundproofed, painted the walls the pale blue Nora picked out from a sample book, and installed a window seat where she could sit and read between practice sessions. The first morning in the new house, I stood in the doorway of that room and listened to Nora play. Sunlight came through the window in long, clean bands, falling across the music stand and the wooden floor and the pale blue walls. She was playing Mendelssohn again, the same piece from the engagement party, but this time there was no patio full of strangers, no fairy lights, no champagne glasses, no Whitney, no Grant, no laughter that wasn't real, just Nora, just the violin. just the sound, perfectly clear, filling a room that belonged to her. She looked up and saw me standing there. "Mom," she said, "you're staring." "I know," I said. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that starts small and takes over a child's whole face before they can stop it. She tucked the violin back under her chin and kept playing. I leaned against the door frame and let the music wash over me. The house was quiet around it. The yard was still. The maple tree outside the window held its bare branches against a winter sky that was pale and wide and perfectly empty. Some things can't be tuned once they're broken. Our relationship was one of them. I accepted that the way you accept a season changing, not with grief, not with anger, just with the understanding that what came before is finished, and what comes next has already begun. Nora made the honor roll that spring. She joined the school orchestra. She made 2 close friends, girls who came over on weekends and sprawled across the living room floor with sketchbooks and juice boxes and the kind of easy, uncomplicated laughter that I wanted her to believe was normal. Because it was. It was supposed to be. I slept through the night for the first time in years. I woke without dread. I drank my coffee while it was still hot. I built my business. I raised my daughter. I lived quietly, deliberately, in a house where nobody laughed at anyone's pain and nobody's silence gave permission for cruelty. The gate code was changed. The contacts were blocked. The group chats were deleted. The checks had stopped. And the only sound that mattered was the one coming from the small blue room at the end of the hall, where a 10-year-old girl played a $15,000 violin in a band of morning light, and the notes rose clean and bright and uninterrupted, the way they were always supposed to. I didn't look back. I never regretted a single second of it. That was the only legacy I gave her. Not money, not status, not the Kessler name and everything it failed to stand for. Just the knowledge that she mattered, that her music mattered, that the people who loved her would never ask her to be less so someone else could feel like more. Some doors close so better ones can open. Ours opened into a sun-drenched room with pale blue walls, and the sound that filled it was perfectly clear. If you enjoyed this story about protecting your children and knowing your worth, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching.